Nick's eyes fluttered open with great effort despite the chill. He was lying face down on the floor of his room, the marble floor sucking the warmth from his body. The right side of his face stung from where he must have hit it. He swung his eye upward and saw two elves standing up on his bed, looking down at his prone form with satisfaction at a job well done. "Good evening, your saintness," one of them cackled. "Rise and shine." "December the 24th, the other added, 2012. 7 billion human souls all out there waiting for you. Oh, to be loved by so many." The two locked arms and danced in a circle on the bed as Nick pulled himself off the floor. "He knows when you are sleeping. He knows if you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good." They turned back to him, and their faces were twisted into a horrible expression of malice. "So be good for goodness sake." Nick ignored them as he grabbed a fresh suit from the closet. There wasn't any choice in what he was to wear. He tossed it on the bed as the elves skittered off, their playfulness apparently gone in the wake of work. "Move it, old man," one of them said. "Get that fat carcass of yours into gear. You haven't got all night, you know." "Actually, he does," the other responded with a wicked grin, and they both laughed that grating little laugh of theirs and walked out. Nick dressed himself in his own time, pulled on the boots, strapped on the belt, pulled on the cap. He inspected himself in the mirror just to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Red cap, red coat, red pants. "It's your color, Nick. Remember? And all because you—" Nick turned away and tried not to think about it. He trudged out of the room into the hall and out into the snow. The sleigh was hooked up. It didn't seem any different than last time, thankfully. It had changed over the years with perceptions, from practical horses to, for some reason Nick could never fathom, reindeer. That had been complicated enough, but then some idiot wrote some bad poetry and everyone started to think the reindeer could fly. That was where Nick would have drawn the line if he could. Then again, he'd stay at home with a bottle of brandy if he had any say in any of this. Come on," pestered the elf sitting inside the sleigh with the huge sack. "Another glorious Christmas Eve. Another chance to show the world what a kind, generous man you are." The other elves laughed that same irritating laugh of theirs, equal parts snickering school children and laughing hyena. He climbed into the sleigh and took hold of the reins. Then he called all the reindeer by name, but only because he had to. With a jerk, the reindeer pulled sleigh monstrosity lifted into the air under the power of a billion deluded imaginations. They rocketed away from the North Pole, the frozen wind driving right through the suit, chilling Nick to the bone. Snowflakes hovered motionless in the air, unless they struck the sleigh or its occupants, where they would instantly melt. Each flake felt like a little tiny dagger where it struck. The elf sat in the back seat, sheltered from the wind itself, but it did nothing to shut him up. Nick didn't know his name. He'd never asked, and they'd never told, and long ago Nick decided that was probably for the best. They were all the same, at least in general terms. 4 feet high, stick-thin limbs, oversized heads, pointy ears, and that slightly off voice of theirs, like they were talking with a bubble in their throat. This one was singing. "Dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh." Nick wiped a snowflake out of his eye as he tried not to swear. He estimated they were traveling several hundred miles per hour. Relatively, of course. You couldn't have real speed without time, and there was no time now. It was midnight, in the truest sense of the word, with Nick trapped in a no-man's land between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. "Laughing all the way, the elf continued. Hours, at least as far as Nick was concerned, passed until the sleigh started to drift below the clouds. A massive airliner hung motionless before them, but the reindeer made a slight change in direction and skirted around it. They sped on until they landed in the little Dutch town of Lindas, right in front of a house. On the ground, Nick thought with relief. He grabbed the huge sack and tossed it over his shoulder and tramped through the snow. The front door was locked, but the window wasn't. He let himself in, dragged the sack in after him, and surveyed the room. Tree, stockings, and over on a table, some biscuits. "So it begins," he said under his voice. He reached into the sack and pulled out present after present, which he sat neatly under the tree, one at a time. No, it wouldn't be nice just to toss them on a big pile, would it, Nick? He grabbed a handful of candy and turned to the stockings, dropping some in the first and then in the second. He reached in again and pulled out... Nick stared at the lump of coal in his hand. First house, and he already had one. He bit his lip as he rolled it over and over in his hand, thinking about things that he couldn't escape from. Finally he dropped it into the stocking and was grateful to find candy for the last. Still, the coal weighed heavily on his mind. He pocketed the biscuits for later when his appetite might return. He tossed the sack out the window and crawled through it, then closed it. "Hey, that's one," the elf said, following it up with a laugh that could unsettle a shark. Nick climbed back in without another word and moved on to the next house. The inn was small, but not so small that Nick stood out in it. He blended into the shadows, not hidden, but rather invisible in plain sight. He was just another face, just another traveler along the road to Lindas, an unremarkable man. Anyone who did mark his face would only note a kindly older gentleman with a face as honest as you would ever find. Not something worth remembering, though, which was important. This year, 1658, was drawing to a close in a matter of weeks, and Nick's observations had shown him the old ways of operating were likely to become more difficult in years to come. The Germanic lands were clearly unsafe for him now, and the Swiss had put a price on his head. Nick had been working on his French lately, a little practice in Belgium to sharpen it up, and on to... The door to the inn opened. Nick didn't look. That would imply that he was waiting for someone. He sat and nursed his mug, but he did glance up as the new arrival stepped into his vision. "Mr. Klaus?" the man asked. "I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else," Nick said, not allowing his irritation to show. Klaus was a wanted man, after all. "Christoph Kringle, if it be your pleasure, stranger, and if you buy me another round, you can call me Chris, as my friends do." Nick was quick with names, this one coming from Christkindl, which he'd heard in passing from the Germans. "Ah, I see, Mr. Kringle," the man said, taking a seat. "Hans Biddlegood, sir, our mutual friend—" "I know," Nick said, taking a drink to give him a moment to pass his eyes around the inn. "Don't look around while we're talking. Just tell me everything." Hans licked his lips. "I was told there'd be gold. 2 now, 4 next week at the meeting place. Assuming your facts bear fruit, of course." "Aye, sir. I've been to every house in Lindas. I see everything." And he told Nick all of it, who, with a lifetime of skill, stored it away in his memory, never missing a beat in his drinking for any outside observer. When Hans had finished, Nick pushed 2 coins into the man's hand, got up, and retired to his room. A fire roared nearby as he pulled out a few sheets of paper and a bottle of ink, sharpened his quill, and wrote it all down. After that was done, he sorted them out into category. Mrs. Vitter, for instance, had just lost her son in an accident at a mill, but she was a sentimental old bird. The right story, and she'd practically be shoving the money into Nick's hand. Mr. Black, however, wouldn't give Nick the satisfaction of a grunt, never mind money, but he was lifting from the counting house, and that little fact would be murder if it got out. He'd happily pay Nick to keep the secret safely buried. Well, not happily, but as long as he paid he could feel whatever he liked. Nick finished copying them all into their columns, carefully checking each one again when he finished to ensure that he put them in the right place. Then when he was finished, he checked them all again, just to be on the safe side. In his line of work, you always had to err on the side of caution whenever you could help it, because the incautious wound up dead. A boot connected with the side of Nick's head, rousing him from the dream. He shook himself and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "Time to wake up," the elf said, hopping into the back of the sleigh and pulling out a pipe. "You ain't hardly started, your saintness. Plenty more boys and girls are out there just waiting for you, you know." He settled back into the seat and put his feet up on the back of the one in front of him, puffed the pipe, and sang, "Oh, he's making a list, checking it twice, gonna find out who's naughty and nice." Nick got the reindeer moving and traveled to the next house. This time they arrived on the roof. That meant all the downstairs doors and windows were locked up tight. Lousy Germans. There was one window at this level. He tried it hopefully. Locked. Nick thought a word that was very, very naughty. "Get a move on," the elf yelled. "The presents aren't going to deliver themselves, you know." Nick trudged over to the chimney. You didn't come across this too often unless you were Santa Claus, which required visiting practically every house on Earth. He climbed on top, pulled up the sack, and slid down. There was a fire at the bottom, naturally, but it was as still as everything, the flames looking like an orange and yellow poinsettia. Nick landed on it without the least worry, climbed out, and entered the room. No tree here. Must be another room. Nick drew to a halt as he stepped through the door, as frozen as the universe around him. He took a step forward, his eyes sliding over the contents of the room as his mouth opened and shut wordlessly. Smoked hams hung in netting that could hold a basketball. Strings of sausage links longer than the reindeer train were strung up. Tightly wrapped roast sat on countertops. In the depths of the acclaimed belly, Nick's stomach spoke up with absolute approval of the situation. Cookies, biscuits, jelly concoctions, fruit pie lumps, nutty bars, jam-filled rolls, gingerbread snacks, fudge, dried fruit, and other variations on the theme were Nick's fare now. He brought them presents and sweets and things to add a little joy, and they left him a tooth-rotting snack as a thank you. And meanwhile they stocked away meals fit for angels to consume at their convenience while admiring his handiwork. For one slice of pork, one link of sausage, he could have had a joy to make this whole long trip worthwhile. But that's not what they left you, he thought bitterly. It's not fair, but you don't take what they haven't offered. That'd be stealing. Be good. Be good for goodness sake. Nick forced himself to leave the room, left the presents, filled the stockings, without even the satisfaction of leaving a lump of coal, and returned to the fireplace. Soon after, if there had been any passage of time at all, the sack dropped onto the roof, soon followed by Nick. He was clean in spite of the whole ordeal. "Get a move on!" the elf shouted from the sleigh. "We've barely started!" The door to Mrs. Vitter's cottage swung open. "Yes?" she asked. Nick stood on the doorstep in a thin coat, hat clenched in his hands. "Pardon the intrusion, madam," he said. "I hate to be a bother, but I've been on a long journey, and I'm afraid my strength has nearly left me. I hate to impose upon you, but I found that pride won't fill my stomach, and I dare not spend another halfpenny, for I have no doubt squandered too much already." Mrs. Vitter looked over his big red face. You could trust a face like that. That was essential. No criminal got far with a dishonest face. "I'm sure I've got something for a weary traveler," she said as she invited him in. "God's blessings on you, madam," Nick said as he followed her inside. She quickly prepared him a plate of food that tasted like the inside of an old boot, but Nick acted as if it was the finest cuisine to ever pass his lips. Over the course of his meal he would drop phrases that prompted questions until he had handed her the whole story. His son had died in a tragic mining accident, and he was on his way to see the lad had a decent burial, but his horse broke its leg not 20 miles into the journey, and he'd had to turn to spending the money he had on lodgings, and soon he'd had to spend so much that all was left was for the funeral, and even that wouldn't be enough. "But he was my son," Nick said as he set the fork down. "I owe it to him to see that he be remembered in as best a way as God can provide me." 12 gold coins jangled in his pocket on the way out of the house a few minutes later, more than he'd expected. Even with Hans' cut, this place had already turned a nice profit, more than enough to get to Belgium in style. He flipped 1 gold coin up in the air and caught it, strolling down the road with a smile on his face despite the chill in the air. Nick woke up in the sleigh. The elf was just smoking his pipe, watching the untwinkling stars. Nick stood up and shook his head. Saigon. I'm still only in Saigon. His work in this part of the world had increased over the years where his story had come to be told. No chimneys. He loved that about this place. Nobody needed chimneys here. It was midnight here in Saigon. It was midnight everywhere that Nick went, despite all logic. After all, it can't be midnight in 2 places on opposite sides of the earth. But then, time doesn't seem to apply to him, not even in this small way. It's always midnight here. Mr. Tanner came into the tavern and spotted Nick. This wasn't the one Nick was staying at. Nick made it a rule never to stay in any town he was fleecing, particularly when a gentleman like Tanner was involved. He came over and dropped into the chair opposite Nick. If looks could kill, Tanner's face was the worst thing to hit Lindas since the Black Death. "The ledger," he said coldly. "You mean the book on the Dutch East India Company?" Nick asked innocently. He'd broken into Tanner's house 2 nights before and departed with it, leaving a little note. 2 days gave the man time to sweat. He'd pay quite handsomely. "I'm sure there's nothing in there you'd need to fear." "Where is it?" Tanner asked, visibly trying to restrain himself. 30 gold pieces, Nick said casually. A small bag dropped onto the table, and Nick picked it up and dumped it into his hand. "Oh, oh, oh." He laughed quietly as he watched the glittering slips tumble. "This will do just fine, Mr. Tanner." "Where is it?" Tanner hissed, which was impressive considering there was only 1 S. "There's a bag behind my chair," Nick said as he stood up. "I'd suggest you wait until I've departed, lest you arouse suspicion." That was the standard line. Sometimes it was so Nick had time to put distance between himself and a dupe who was left holding an empty bag, but he was going to be here another day, and that would be trouble he didn't need. Then he'd stop, pay Hans on the way out of town, as agreed. You always delivered with your snitches, because word got around if you didn't. Penny wise, pound foolish, as they say. After all, Nick had already raised the equivalent of over 100 gold pieces in this town thanks to Hans' big mouth. It paid to keep a mouth like that talking. "Wake up!" Nick felt a slap across the side of his head. He opened his eyes and saw himself. He blinked again and focused. Not exactly him. Nick wasn't 30 feet tall and never told anyone that the greatest gift of all this holiday was half off an oil change at Beats Auto and Tire. America. These people were the greatest blessing and foulest curse. They treated this time of year like it was the build-up to the second coming, assuming you could prepare your soul for judgment by buying useless junk and strategically placing ugly trash inside and outside your house. There were mock-up versions of himself everywhere, on roofs and lawns, doorways, even floating on balloons in the air. They had him drinking soft drinks with polar bears and holding slices of pizza and reminding everyone not to drink and drive. He was standing side by side with snowmen and Jesus Christ and Scrooge and sometimes people in suits and ties he didn't recognize. Apparently he wanted to sell everything in the world that could be bought, up to and including small animals. Perhaps someone would be interested in some flatulent reindeer, he wondered for a moment. Nick walked up to the next house. Everything was locked. He dropped the sack, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a set of lockpicks. In a few seconds there was a glitter of pixie dust, and the door slid open. It was quick and easy, but he was only allowed this option if there was no other way, just like it had always been for him. Lockpicking had always taken time, and you couldn't explain yourself away if you were caught. He stepped inside and sighed. One of those places, huh? He helped himself to a celery stick and a carrot that they'd left out because Santa's getting too fat, you know. Didn't you see the sign, kids? Santa says a double cheeseburger is the perfect holiday gift. Nick gnawed on the celery as he reached into the bag. This is where things got a little weird. He pulled out a present. There was an identical one under the tree. As he put it in place, the other faded into nothingness. But it bore his name, from Santa, and he wasn't allowed to take credit for gifts he didn't actually give. There were rules about this sort of thing, and it wasn't nice to break the rules. He stuffed the first 2 stockings with toys and sweets. Thanks for the carrot, he thought bitterly. Then he pulled out a lump of coal. As he held it in his hands, though, it changed shape and finally transformed into a pair of old woolen gloves with a tear at the pinky and about as watertight as a doily. The next lump of coal turned into a pair of blue and red socks and were dutifully stuffed. Few places ever got the actual coal, but it always started out as a little lump of coal. Nick ran through the Dutch snow as best he could, arms wrapped around himself to try and keep the cold out. There were shouts from behind, but they were confused. He probably had lost them for the moment. Unfortunately, he'd lost his gold and his coat as well. But when a man with a pistol kicks down your door, Nick knew the first rule was to put distance between him and you. Who had called him in? There were any number of possibilities, but Nick had tried to maintain a low profile. He was now running through the darkness towards the glow of the city itself. He was supposed to meet Hans on the edge of town anyway for final payment. Something could probably be worked out. He was certain of that. He coughed, being too old and too out of shape for this kind of thing, but he pushed on. Part of being a con was remembering that running away was sometimes your only option, no matter what it meant leaving behind. Hans was just outside the town with his sleigh, gathering a few lumps of firewood before he made his deliveries on this evening before Christmas with a little something extra to keep the fire roaring. He stopped as he saw Nick running towards him, but he seemed puzzled. Hans was rather slow on the uptake. "Where's your coat?" he asked. "Never mind," Nick said. "How'd you like an extra 150 gold pieces? Just get me a coat and a horse, and they're yours." Hans looked at him suspiciously. "Where's the gold you owed me first?" "Back in my room at the inn," Nick said. "Aha," he said, distrust filling both syllables to the brim. "I had to leave in rather a hurry." "And I'm sure whoever drove you off left the gold," Hans said with a knowing shake of his head. "You ain't succoring me, Mr. Kringle." "I swear to you." "Hey, he's over here!" Hans yelled into the darkness. Nick never carried a weapon, but he'd learned a little in his younger years before he'd honed his craft. Hans' hands were full, and it would take a moment for him to realize there was a problem. Nick seized a lump of firewood as wide as his arm, brought it up, and smashed it onto Hans' head. He repeated the gesture for good measure, then tossed it aside. A temporary reprieve, but unfortunately he'd just raised the stakes to murder. Hans' sleigh waited nearby, though. Nick pulled the coat off the dead man and put it on, trying to wipe the blood off. He heaved the sack of coal into the back seat, grabbed the reins, and rode the sleigh off into the darkness. "Wake up, fatty," the elf said as he smacked Nick across the face with the empty sack. "Time to head home." Nick roused himself, then looked around. Puerto Williams, he thought. The most southern actual settlement in the world, and the last stop in his journey. Oh sure, there was the sprawling ice continent a short ways further, but Nick's work didn't bring him there. Which was a pity. Puerto Williams. At midnight, local time, the sun would be a fraction within the 12-degree requirement for nautical twilight. As the sleigh lifted off, Nick looked back to the south, the altitude shaving bits off until there was just the faintest discoloration at the southern horizon. Daylight was so close here, probably an hour away as the reindeer flies. But Nick had no choice in where he took the sleigh. He bitterly pointed towards the North Pole and got the reindeer into a full gallop over the open ocean. Still, it would take nearly a day of non-time to travel 10,000 miles back home, which is why Nick always got one last nap in before the trip. The reindeer may seem like they drove themselves, but they still needed a driver, and the elf had no interest in sharing the load. Nick glanced back and saw the little figure was already napping himself. I could push him over the side. No, that would be naughty, even if he deserved it. In the quiet, interrupted only by the snoring of the elf like a saw going through a loaf of fossilized bread, Nick watched the stars, the only movement now that the water stretched from horizon to horizon. But they didn't twinkle. Even the stars ignored Nick. The night was bitter, and the coat was too small for a portly man like Nick. He tried to keep the cold out, but it was like trying to carry water in a sheet. It found ways in. But he had to push on, had to put distance between himself and Lindas. The horse protested, but he spurred it on with the whip for a time. But the weather proved too much even for the beast, and it eventually collapsed far in the wilderness. It didn't respond to Nick's prods. The cold was in his bones. Nick tried to think, but wilderness survival hadn't been a necessary skill in his trade. There was nothing to see by. Christmas Eve was a new moon this year, and there wasn't even the distant sign of a cottage, only those uncaring stars. Nick fumbled in the pockets of the coat for a tinder box, but there was nothing. Wandering into the wilderness was certain death. At least the sleigh offered some small shelter from the wind. He considered slicing open the horse for the warmth, but no means to actually do so came to mind. He settled into the sleigh, wrapped the cloak around himself, and shivered in quiet misery. Dawn would come eventually. Warmth and light. Nick shuddered, knowing that it would be many hours away, but he had no other choice. In the cold, in the dark, time itself seemed to abandon him, and Nick could feel his body succumbing to the inevitable. Just a little longer. Just a little longer until you see the sun. Then he died. The sleigh settled to a stop outside the cottage. The elves were waiting. There were only words of criticism, as there always were. Nick brushed them off, passed them the empty sack, and trudged inside. How much non-time had it taken this time? A year? 2? How long does it really take to visit all those people? Nick gratefully changed out of the outfit into a more comfortable sleeping gown and crawled into his warm, comfortable bed, too exhausted to even put his suit in the laundry. He'd gotten the job done, that was what mattered. And maybe next year would be better. Maybe. There was a glow of light, and for just a moment Nick thought it was the sun. He got up in the sleigh, and his breath froze, or would have if he were still breathing. It was a man, bathed in light, 12 feet tall and dressed in pure white. His eyes looked Nick up and down as he trembled under the glare. "It's time," he said in a voice that wasn't loud, but seemed to still have echoes within, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "Time for what?" Nick asked, fearful of the answer. The man glared at him. "Judgment." He paused. "Cold?" Nick swallowed and managed a small nod. "Very well." And with that the ground cracked open nearby, and flames licked up from their depths. Inside was the sound of a chorus of screams and wails. Nick shrunk back from it, then turned to the man, who was reaching a great hand down, but he took up the sack from the back. He plucked out a lump, held it over the crack, and it turned to flame. He placed it on the snow where it burned. "Warm yourself," he offered, but Nick remained where he was. The man turned his back on him for the moment and looked over the horse. He reached out towards it kindly, and for a moment it glowed as well, then returned to its feet. It was like a dog by comparison, and the man patted it like a faithful pet. "All it ever did was its duty," he informed Nick. "It deserved a better end." He turned back to him. "You, however, do not." Nick's mind raced. Many times over the course of his career his skills were necessary to ensure his very survival, but now, with the glare of the man of judgment, he knew it needed to be the finest performance ever. "You must have me mistaken for someone else." He winced inwardly. That was a very poor start. "I swear to you, I'm a man of virtue." "Swear?" The man said it in a voice with undertones that made the trees rumble and carried on far longer than the utterance itself. "You think any divine being would witness the truth of such a lie?" Nick's mouth opened and closed, but no words could find their way out. The man snatched up the sack again. "I know you, you who would call yourself Kris Kringle. You were taught well as a lad, taught how you were expected to act, kindness, generosity of spirit." He rummaged inside the sack. Why is your coat red? Nick looked down at the bloodstains. In the glow of the fire he could see them on his hands as well. I... he faltered. The old man leaned down, his huge head cocked until one eye was staring directly at him, his massive hand gripped as a fist before him. Do you remember, Nicholas, what you were taught would happen to... And with each word his thumb pushed a lump of coal between his fingers for Nick to see. Naughty little boys? Nick swallowed again, but the eyes seemed to pin him in place. He was too afraid to answer. The man tossed the coals at the fire, which roared up, "They burn!" The word was like a great thunder that rolled over the hillside, and Nick was weeping. But finally, desperation had found the switch that operated his mouth and hastily flicked it on. I realize how this must look to you, Nick babbled, but I assure you I am not what you think. I am renowned and kind and generous, giving to all without thought of repayment, a saint, adored by everyone whose path I cross. My only concern has always been for the happiness of others. He felt the stare, but he pressed on. I admit I sometimes have partaken of their goods, but in all cases I take only what is offered to me and not one iota more. All I want is to spread happiness to others, and my only regret at this unfortunate passing is that I can no longer continue the blessed work of charity and goodwill that I had been doing. The man of judgment's face was absolutely unreadable. And who would affirm such an outrageous lie? Anyone, Nick said hastily. Nick awoke on the cold marble floor of his room, two elves looking down upon him with a snickering laugh. He'd landed on one of the boots he'd left out the night before, leaving a sharp pain in his side. Time to get a move on, your saintness, the one said. December the 24th, 2013, and it's a very busy night. But first clean up this mess. Nick did as his jailers had told him, then brought out the red coat and began preparing for the long, long night. Until they all believe you, Nick. Until there's no man, woman, or child on earth who wouldn't hesitate to say that you are the kindest, most generous man who ever lived. Until you've lived up to your own con. And it must be done right. The man of judgment has made that very, very clear. I know when you're sleeping. I know when you're awake. I know if you've been bad or good. And so Nick went out into the world and gave gifts to everyone. To the good he gave toys and sweets and joy, but to those who were a bit more naughty than nice, he gave an even kinder gift, a lump of coal. And if you find a little lump in your stocking, watch it burn, and remember the warning of old Saint Nick. You'd better watch out.